Hey guys, Wolverine here. I am a coach, a challenger player, and one of the best Soraka players in the world. Last season, I got challenger with a 65% win rate on Soraka mid. I've been talking about the champion for a while. I think she's really strong. She's been one of the best champs in the game for well over a year. So now that C9 has picked her mid in LCS, I thought I would make a guide. The reason Soraka mid works and the reason a lot of other enchanters work in solo lanes is that enchanters actually scale really well with golden XP. Soraka is like one of the best scalers in the game. She scales with golden XP like better than most carries. But whereas something like Sona has pretty weak laning, Soraka's laning is actually really strong. She's a huge lane bully. At early levels, you're beating pretty much anyone mid, although the current mid meta is pretty bad for her as far as laning. You lose to Victor and Syndra, but come team fight phase, it'll be very sad because you will have outscaled them. You're just going to be a much harder carry. So I would not be scared to pick Soraka into those champions. As far as rune setups, this is going to be your main page. Airy, Manaflow, Transcendence, obviously. Gathering Storm can be switched for Scorch in any contested lane. You do tend to have a lot of contested lanes or lanes where this gets a lot of value. So I would say this is a pretty common rune for her. There are a lot of lanes that you want to bully very hard. For secondary, you're always taking Resolve, Conditioning, Revitalize. You can switch this to Second Wind in hard lanes like Syndra or Victor. For shards, I take Attack Speed. Soraka's auto attacks are pretty slow, so this is really good for lasting, for trading, for push. Since your push is very auto attack based, for trades you want to hit like auto Qs or Q autos without the attack speed, like that's very slow. So this is gonna transition to like a lot more push, a lot more damage in trades, and unless you're very good at last hitting, it's just gonna straight up equal more gold because Soraka's last hitting is pretty hard. Um, you can switch to double resist in hard lanes. I usually don't take the health shard because your effective HP is so high from all the healing you're getting. For bot lane, you have the Guardian setup. This is for lanes where you're very scared of like they're 2v2, they're like all in, or you're scared of getting dove. I would say it's not super common, like it's not a great page. I would usually just go Airy. But obviously, sorcery secondary, mana flow is kind of a rune that you have to take, and revitalize is definitely a rune that you have to take, so you tend to not go away from resolve sorcery. And this is just because that while Soraka gets a lot of mana regen, she doesn't build any mana. So for short bursts of using a lot of mana, if you don't have mana flow band, you will run out a lot. And then again, obviously you have options within here. This is a rune setup for top lane specifically. I think top lane is her worst role. I think ADC is actually her best, but in this meta, like ADC is obviously very strong and mid is pretty weak. So I think mid Soraka gains more value. But in general, I think ADC Soraka is her strongest role by a pretty decent margin. And like I said, I think top is her worst. I think it's just very matchup based. You just have to get a good matchup for it. But this is a viable page. I don't think it's very good, but you actually do get a lot of value from Fleet. You actually get really big heals once you get like Moonstone. Obviously, you're getting revitalized. But yeah, the problem is Precision Tree doesn't give you good minor runes. And again, you're missing mana flow. So if you're in a situation where you're using mana very quickly, like you can expend your whole mana pool in a team fight. This is another top lane page that I've only done a couple times. Haven't researched it enough, but it is an interesting concept to me where you do get the trees that you want. You just say grasp instead of fleet. But again, when you're taking runes like these, all it really comes down to is the matchups. Like these would have to allow you to play a matchup that you otherwise could not play, or affect a matchup in a way that you're getting a lot of value, enough to outvalue Airy in like mid game. Because keep in mind that Airy does have like pretty decent scaling. You're gonna get like a couple hundred extra shielding in team fights, versus like Grasp is not doing much. Fleet is doing all right. You're getting like an extra like 100, 150 self heal. But yeah, this would just require more top lane research. I don't play top lane Soraka, so where these would be good again is if they could allow you to play matchups that you couldn't otherwise play. Um, Another page you can run is Spellbook. I would say this is just almost never better than Airy. The only time I can see it being better is if like you're really desperate for like minion demats to like break you out of certain like laning patterns where you can kill cannon minions with this because your cannon take on Soraka is very slow. But yeah, not very good. I don't think. So as far as spell leveling, this is actually pretty important. Most of the time, you're going to go 3 points Q, and then you're going to max W. This is very important because your W gets a lot of value out of spell points, and this is your big spike. Is level 10, you'll get this. It gets all the way down to 2 seconds. This will be like 1.3 with ability haste. So that is very large. And obviously level 11, you get rank 2 ult. And this will be around the same time you're completing Moonstone. So this is when you spike. This is when you take over the game. This is when you are the strongest champion on the map. You could theoretically go 4 points Q if you think the laning phase is going to be very long, but it's not super necessary because 3 points is when 2 Qs will kill the backline minions until very high minion levels. But if you reach those minion levels and you like knew you weren't going to be team fighting, you could go 4 points Q, but it's very rare. I've only done it a couple times. And obviously after W max, you're just going to max Q. Like some people will say max E, they're tweakers. Just max Q second. You just get a lot of value. In any case where you would do 4 points Q, I would in most games do W at level 11 and save rank to ult for level 12. It is a bit comp dependent, but most of the time you're going to max W at level 11. Yeah, as far as build, you have 2 possible starts. You can go Dorn's Ring a lot of the time. You'll do this in any contested lane, any lane where you're trading. Because obviously you get the mana regen, you get the 5 damage on minion autos, so that helps your push actually a decent amount. The other start is Dark Sill Refill. You do this in like very hard lanes or very easy lanes because it's just the econ buy, right? You don't need the mana regen if you're not trading very heavily. And you don't need the push, obviously, if you're either getting the push regardless or getting pushed in regardless. And you get refill instead of 2 pots. So you get more value there. You can also do Dark Seal and 3 pots in hard lanes. When you're building into Moonstone, you generally want to avoid Band of Glass Mirror, which is not a good item. It does gain value when you go Dark Seal start, because then you're a bit lacking in mana regen. But generally, you're looking at Amp Tome and Ruby Crystal. Kindle Gem is also not good, honestly. If you don't start Dark Seal, you want to buy it very quickly. This is just a very OP item in general and very good on Soraka because you stack it quickly and you keep it easily. Tier 1 boots, obviously. So you have a lot of options for like how you build it on like first recalls. But yeah, this is your general priority of how you get into it. I try to save tier 2 boots for after Moonstone usually because you want to get this spike very quickly. One of the advantages of Enchanter mids is that you finish your mythic before mages. So you get to spike quicker, you can take team fights like on those timers, and you're much stronger. So generally you save tier 2 boots. These do gain value in like harder lanes, or if you're trying to move a lot, because you get quicker recalls, and you can also dodge skill shots versus like Syndra. So the only other first item you would go is Staff of Flowing Water. This is actually very underrated. I don't think I've ever seen any other Soraka player ever build this first, but it is pretty good in specific spots. You get similar heals. It's a little bit less, but they're actually pretty similar. It's like 360 to 390 on your W, but you are giving like 1200 gold in stats. It's like 800 AP, like 500 in ability haste. So if you're playing with like a Gwen jungle or a Gwen top and like that's your comp is like the Soraka Gwen, like this can be a very good start. Because you're putting like 1200 in stats on her at that point, and they're useful stats that she actually uses. And at that point in the game, once you have this item, she probably only has like 2,500, 3,000 gold herself. So 1,200 in stats can be very oppressive early. Um, since even though this has leveling scaling, right, like it scales off levels, it's not going to scale well into the game purely because it's just flat stats. Um, when you're looking at second items, you have a lot of options. Soraka actually has very good AP scalings on her heal relative to other enchanters, so the AP items are going to do quite well. Highest healing is Staff of Flowing Water second. Redemption is going to be your typical go-to buy. It has a little bit less straight healing, but you get a lot of value. As far as the active, hit three people, you're healing for like 1600. This gains more value in like close fights, a lot of melees, just any grouping. Or if there's a kindred in the game, either on your team or enemy team, this is an absolute must buy. Um, you obviously throw this down in kindred ult. You're going to R right as it ends. That clears grievous wounds. You're healing your entire team for 1200 each, no counterplay. Chemtech is, obvious when it's being built. I think this is better in solo queue than competitive because solo queue players are very bad at anticipating healing or playing around it. Um, so this just gains more value, and they'll also overbuy Grievous Wounds themselves, so you can convince them not to buy it if you are getting it. In competitive, I'd just rather have players learn to, play around and anticipate healing, unless it is, a legitimate healing comp and this is getting real value. You do have to consider like what your game needs, though, because I think a lot of people think of Grievous Wounds as a utility buy, but it is just a damage buy. So you have to ask if like what your team needs is damage, or if you would gain more value elsewhere. So that's just what it comes down to: is how much damage will this deal? Is that going to be more valuable than increased healing elsewhere? Mikhail's again is an obvious one. I think the only non-obvious part about Mikhail's is that it does give 50 MR. So this is very good into stuff like Kennen or Syndra, where you are maybe afraid of being one shot. But obviously into stuff like Kennen, you're gonna go, like Redemption second, drop it on a roll, but maybe third item. Maybe if you are scared of like Syndra flashing onto you, that is just something to consider. Warmogs, this is a pretty rare buy, but it actually is very powerful in the spots where it's good. This is what you would buy into like very heavy poke comps. Because if you are unaware, Soraka's W costs 10% max health unless you hit your Q. Then it costs nothing, obviously. So in team fights, it's very important to be hitting your Qs or you drain your health. So Soraka is typically weak to poke because she has a finite amount of heals she can give before she runs out of health when she's not in combat and able to hit Qs. Now, most of the time when you're getting poked, if the enemy team has like an Ezreal or just a Jace, and that's like their lone champion, you will just take red buff, right? And red buff will give you out of combat heal, and that is actually very strong. It's a bit hard to convince your teams to do, but it is stupidly strong to give your Soraka red buff. You will just delete Ezreal from the game. You just get unlimited healing, but in spots where like their entire comp is poke, maybe you pick Soraka early and their response is to try and outrange you and poke you instead of team fight you, you can just go second item Warmogs and delete their composition. This does not stop until you take damage though, so you have to make sure people are blocking for you. You have infinite heals. You will out heal just all their poke. Ardent Sensor, again, obvious where it's good. I do think this item gets like a bit of a bad rap. Like it's seen as like turbo useless. I think it's a bad item. Like it's not great. Like it's very average, but I think it's a bit underrated because it does actually have like pretty strong healing. It's the second highest healing outside of Staff of Flowing Water because it does give high AP and 10% heal and shield power. One thing to consider though is that Ardent Sensor gives no ability haste, which actually does feel pretty bad. Your W is 1.33 versus something like 1.17 or 1.21, which is actually pretty significant. So something to consider. This item is just not very good, very niche, I would say. These three, obviously, your defensive options. Again, not very good, but not super terrible. You do have, again, good AP scalings on your healing, so you look at just the numbers and it's pretty comparable to Mikhail's or Chemtech, although these are 300 gold more. Anathema's does not give you any AP, so your heals are going to be really low. You'd only buy this if it's just the only way you can survive, and that's what you like need to do, because a lot of the time you don't really care if you die as Soraka. You can just get your spells off and your team should win the fight. So these are very rare. Um, I would say these four items are going to take up 90% of your games, and Warmongs is very good in niche spots. These four are pretty weak. So these are like 90%. Um, Moonstone probably like looking at like 80% of the time. There's like 20. Dark Seal and Dorns are probably like around a 50-50 split. It just kind of depends on your matchups, but these are pretty equally strong. If anything, I favor the Dark Seal, but I'm probably a little bit biased. So as far as auxiliary items, after first item, you're looking at getting a support item. Timing is really just whenever you stop farming. In solo queue, you can maybe get away with Spell Thieves, but Relic Shield is just the better item, especially for competitive, because you're just going to stack it a lot easier. People aren't going to be standing around letting you just consistently get in poke. Stack Spell Thieves, and after 15 minutes, cannons will spawn every other wave, so you'll just stack this a lot quicker. The stats are like a little bit worse, but it doesn't really matter. You're just doing it for the gold generation. The only time you wouldn't get this is if you already have a lot of gold and you're trying to get like a really quick second item. But after these are fully stacked, you can start looking at Vigilant Wardstone as a potential buy. The actual warding passive is pretty terrible just because wards scale really badly. But you get a lot of stats from it, so it's pretty good. Magi's is not something I buy very often. I think Dark Seal is ridiculously OP. You should buy it every single game, but I just don't think Magi's is that good. Often because like your gold generation is kind of low. I think it's better in competitive. But in solo queue, if you get Magi's like after first item, it's gonna be hard to get to your second item. But in competitive, you should like have more gold, and you're also less likely to like drop stacks. So you should be able to stay alive. So I think it's okay. Stopwatch, very good, obviously. Elixir, very good. You can buy stuff like this before big fights. You should this on every champion. It's crazy that like pro teams will go to like Dragon Soul or Third Dragon, you know, game deciding fights without buying elixirs. So yeah, buy elixirs. So as far as what you actually want to pair Soraka with, C9 ended up pairing it with Olaf, which I was a big fan of. And just as a quick aside, like teams will talk about like mid 2v2 as being like super important, but you'll never see them pick things like Soraka Olaf. Like they aren't picking Draven mid. Like it's just choice supportive bias. It's not real. Anyone who says mid 2v2 probably a noob. Um, but I digress. You want fighters. You want tanky champions. You want people who can like continually take damage over like long fights, right? Um, Soraka doesn't pair like comparatively well with ADCs relative to like other enchanters because ADCs more want like shielding or move speed or like attack speed or like crazy good peel, right? They want utility. And they also have like you know very low base health, right? So it's kind of hard for Soraka to get a lot of value there, versus like champions who can like continually let her ramp because you know she has like 1 second cooldown on W, right? So you are looking for long fights where you can continually keep pumping out heals. Um, something to note is that on these champions, you want to build resistances because your EHP is going to be like very, very high, right? Higher than it usually would be. So actually, the like Sterix nerf and Death Dance buffs were crazy good for Soraka because Soraka hates Sterix and loves Death Dance. Gwen isn't here, but Gwen is like a very good pairing. As far as bot lane pairings, you're usually playing with melee supports. You can play with enchanters. Double enchanter is good, and it's good when Soraka's mid too. It's just very dependent on like what comp the enemy team plays in response and like what their bot lane is. But usually in solo queue, especially at like lower levels of competitive, you want to play with melee supports. That's just because your 2v2 is a lot stronger in general. Because they play with her E very well and they play with her healing very well, where the melee support will just play super aggressively, and it's never possible to like turn onto this champion. So they can go for like really aggressive looks because they're never going to die, and all of them pair very well with her E, so you have a ton of kill pressure into a lot of lanes. I think Shen is one of her best. I think this should have been the response to Yuumi at Worlds. I think there's a lot of responses to Yuumi first pick, but this is one of the better ones. If you don't have like an Ezreal with Yuumi, you're going down like 30 CS, like you're gonna get 2v2 killed. This lane is incredibly good in general though. Obviously with the flash taunt into Soraka Silence, has a ton of kill pressure. If like the enemy bot lane is like particularly high EHP, Shen will go Hail of Blades. But yeah, this lane is just very strong in general because again, Soraka is a lane bully, and then you have crazy kill threat with the Shen. So if you took something like Aphelios Nautilus and the response was Soraka Shen, like you're just not playing the game. You're going down like 30 CS. Another good pairing is Jarvan. You can throw down the silence. Jarvan EQ comes out. That means they can't flash it, and then obviously they're getting snared afterwards. After level 6, you have the option of silencing inside the Cataclysm. So that's quite good. Set, another good one. You'll notice that all of these supports are like higher damage. This is gonna just in like a straight up 2v2, Soraka is like a bit low DPS where like her actual trading comes in. She's quite strong, like she's good in trades, but in a straight 2v2 she's a bit low damage. So generally you want a support with like threat. If I were to take like Soraka Rel, like this isn't going to be strong because we don't have the damage to actually kill you inside of like a CC combo, versus anything else, if you actually get hit by like CC into Soraka Silence into Snare, like you're just dying, right? So we're missing out on that kill threat, but also in a straight 2v2, it can be a lot easier to just like ignore the Rel after you're CC'd and go on to the Soraka, whereas like if you have a set that's not possible, right? Like you're just going to die to the set, but you obviously can't focus the melee support because then they're getting Soraka heals and they are never dying. So Soraka with supports like this is very, very strong 2v2, but obviously just pairing her with like double enchanter is very good. Senna is like a classic matchup or pairing, which is again very good. Thresh is an interesting one. He kind of breaks the mold a little bit, where he doesn't have as much damage as the other three. So like your straight up 2v2 isn't as strong, but he does still work well just because he gets a lot of value out of the silence. So you can like flay with Glacial Augment. That'll be a silence into a snare, which means a guaranteed hook. But the big thing about champions like these is even though like if you're playing like Draven Thresh, obviously if you hit a hook, they're gonna die, right? But the thing about Soraka with melee supports is she allows them to play in a way that they otherwise couldn't, right? Because if you're with Draven or you're with Aphelios or whoever, right? A lot of the time when you're looking for hooks, looking for flays, it can just become okay, we're going to kill the Thresh, right? And that's the same for mid game too, right? If we're, you know, posturing for Dragon, a lot of the time Thresh can't exert as much control as he would like to because it can simply become, okay, we're going to kill Thresh here, right? When you're playing with Soraka, that's not possible usually, right? So you get a lot more opportunities to like actually play forward, and you would get hooks and flays that you otherwise wouldn't. You get like a lot of good gang setup, but I wouldn't say it's like a fantastic pairing, but like it is good. Like same thing with Blitzcrank, where yeah, if you hit the hook, they're gonna die. But the big thing is that you're getting more spots to get hooks than you otherwise would. But yeah, again, that's another pairing that's not fantastic. I'd say that one's even worse than Thresh, but Thresh is actually a good pairing, and Soraka likes playing with Thresh on her team even when she's mid. And that extends to the other supports as well. I mean, she even likes, having like Shen top. And that's just because, she likes having frontliners, she likes having CC, she likes having Peel, depending on, what the enemy team drafts. And that leads us into, what is good into Soraka, which there's a lot of ways you can try to draft into it. I don't think there's any good answer. Like the champ is just OP. One way is you try and pick like dive and burst, and you try and just one shot the Soraka, which is okay. The problem is that she has a lot of options, and the champions she plays are very good against this. Right? So this is a lot of the reason why you like melee supports, you like peel supports. Like, okay, I take Soraka Shen into this, I have Shen ult on top of me, right? If you take like Tryndamere, um, I block auto attacks. And even outside of this, if like this is your entire comp is trying to one shot the Soraka, she can just take like Banshee second, she can take Zanya second. Again, it's not going to cut down her healing like a crazy amount. And if that's your entire win con, she can just win by denying that. But even in a regular build, when you see these engages coming in, you can drop redemption on top of them, right? Stuff like Fiddlesticks or Kennen, like they really hate seeing redemption. Then you even have like Mikhail's third that gives her 50 MR, as well as being able to cleanse CC. You can even Mikhail second in certain comps. And again, the champions she's playing with like playing into stuff like this, right? So even if you kill the Soraka, now you have to deal with like the rest of her team that are very good into the champions that you've picked, right? If you're picking like full burst, full dive, like, and she ends up getting a redemption off, maybe like if you don't one shot her, she's also getting her ult off, you have to put more damage into her, and she heals her team, and like the rest of her champions are going to kill you, right? So I would say burst is okay. It's good in solo queue. Might be something I'd do at like lower levels of competitive. But I think once you get to like high level play, this becomes really bad. Poke is similarly bad if you pick like a full poke comp. Because obviously she can just get red buff, get warmogs, and your comp becomes useless. But I think poke elements are good. Like you can take something like Vel'Koz, which I think is just a broken champion, like one of the most underrated champs in the game. Where like yeah, the E silence feels really bad in like early and even like very early mid, like first dragon fights or whatever. But later into the game, like you have poke, you have that range advantage, but you also have like good team fighting. You have the ability to maybe burst her if you take like Malphite Vel'Koz. But again, like if I just have Shen, it's like okay, now that combo like Soraka's out of kill range, right? And if you continue indexing into this combo, then she builds defensive items and you lose. I think one of the better ways to draft into Soraka is just try and match. Just try and pick your own hyper carries, preferably long range. Soraka doesn't like playing into range, both like in lane and in team fights. So like Azir is one of like her better counters mid, one of her best actually. Like this lane is really rough. And then even as the game goes on, it's still bad because Soraka wants to keep her allies close to her, right? So like if Olaf is diving a champion like Azir or Jinx, he's going to be very far out of her range versus something like Aphelios, well, like it's a hyper carry and it's dealing the damage that you need to compete with Soraka. It's going to be a lot worse because not only will Soraka just beat him in lane if she gets flex spot and can actually beat him like very hard, even in team fights, it's a lot better for her because the champions that she's healing can play with her a lot easier while having threat on Aphelios. which is something you want to do. You want to make sure you're not diving too far, especially like, you'll play stuff like Hacker with Soraka sometimes. You want to make sure you're not diving too far. Although that's a reason champions like Hecarim prefer like a Yumi, because um, obviously that is a weakness of Soraka, is she can't go too far on engage. So that's why you want to have a range advantage if you can, but it also has to be DPS, right? Like, you couldn't do like Ezreal Xerath here because then you don't have the DPS, and Soraka has responses to poke. But in this situation, you have the DPS, but you also have poke options. Like, you do maintain range advantage, so you will still be getting damage out. If she doesn't have red buff, that can be like a problem. But the issue with like matching hypercarry for hypercarry is just that Soraka will outperform most carries. We saw this in the C9 game where at 2 items, Soraka will outheal like both of these champions combined. Even at 3 items, like, they're not going to be a problem for her. Um, if you start doing stuff like this, like it can be winning here. So like a comp like this into this, like, this would be winning, right? This is going to just be high enough damage for you to contend with Soraka, right? You have the Kagwa, who's going to be putting out a ton of DPS, and then Viger has his R, which is very good as well, for finishing targets, making sure Soraka isn't able to heal for like a super long amount of time. Another thing to consider is like disruption is good against Soraka. So you could maybe do something like a Wukong here, or a Malphite even, where you're not diving, but you're just stopping her from being able to free heal. The same way you would want to stop like an Azir or Jinx from free hitting, because that's how you should think of Soraka. Soraka is a hyper carry, right? She is an Azir who's free hitting. She's like a Kagwa that's free hitting. And if you can't match that, which is already very, very hard, if you can't match it, like, you have to disrupt it. So even stuff like Tryndamere is good, but this is a lot of the reason why, again, melee supports are good. So like, if you're taking Tryndamere, like, Shen shuts that down really hard. In the C9 game, they had Thresh, which is also very good. So this stops you from disrupting Soraka or makes it more difficult. But stuff like this is good. The bigger problem with drafting against Soraka is she gets too much power for how versatile she is. So in league drafting, typically there's a balance between like how strong a champion is versus how niche they are, right? So you look at champions like Lowy, Nasus, Viger, even like Yi, and these champions aren't like bad. They're just niche, right? And if these champions are able to get their niche, like if you give them their win con, they just win the game. So that's their threat, right? The trade-off is that they can't be picked without those conditions. Soraka fits in this spot where if you give her her condition, she will hard carry the game. So you have to draft against her. But she's also super versatile on top of that. She can just be first picked because she's a 4-roll flex. She can fit in a lot of comps, and it's like, what can even be the response, right? You can look at something like Karma Jinx, and this will just get met with something like Xerath Jarvan. And now these are 3 flexes. This draft can still go anywhere, but like your Jinx is very scared. Like post 6, Xerath moves, Cataclysm, Silence, she's not living. Like, Xerath presses R, she's just dying. You can try and like move Karma mid, pick Thresh to help the Jinx, but okay, now you're very low damage. You have a Karma mid versus Xerath. Like, this is terrible as well. Can also just take like Hecarim Shen, and your Jinx is having a hard time living. I would say Seraphine is in general better than Karma. You can look at something like Seraphine Xin, Seraphine Gwen, Seraphine like Irelia, Karma Tryndamere, but then stuff like Shen gains a lot of value. Any like fighters gain value. You can do like Olaf, you can do Fiora, you can do whatever. Like Soraka would love to get into a melee fight. She loves it when melees are fighting, right? But you can't really go range. You can't really do like Xerath or Vel'Koz because she has such good like options with playing forward with like Shen, Hecarim, Jarvan. You can do like Hecarim, Shen, and I mean like it might be a little bit early to pick Hecarim, but you get the point. The issue is just that Red Side's draft is so limited. The second first pick Soraka comes out because you have to be respecting a hyper carry, right? It's the same thing as if they're picking like Kog'Maw first pick. It's that same level of threat where now the draft becomes like a Kog'Maw draft, right? Like you're playing that game. It's similar to when Kog'Maw had his AP and AD variation, and they were both strong. Where Kog'Maw was like an S tier first pick, and honestly, like he couldn't be drafted into at that point. Like I think he should have just been a ban, um, because he can just switch his playstyle, and you can't just pick dive because you dive AP Kog'Maw and AD Kog'Maw differently. So if you just took Gragas and Yasuo, like it's not like a bad response, but then there's a lot of counterplay on blue side draft, and like you just ban that champion. Like it was too difficult, and I think Soraka is just the same way. Where if this champion like actually had a good read in pro meta, she would just be red side ban. Like you just can't draft into it really. There's too many responses. You have to do too many things, and the big thing that like Soraka has that even like Kog'Maw or Varus never had when they were like super strong, flexible picks is that at any time Kog'Maw or Soraka can just be dropped to support, right? If I think you have like effectively drafted against carry Soraka, Soraka can just be moved to support and not be like a pivotal part of blue side draft, right? Unless you've obviously drafted like into it, right? If you drafted to play for Soraka, but you can keep your draft very flexible still, and not you're not forced into a Soraka draft in the same way that like first pick Kog'Maw. It's like okay, we're playing a Kog'Maw draft now, right? Um, it's just too much. It's just too much. You have to pick an enchanter, because you have to get 60% grievous wounds immediately. No other grievous wounds items work. Like it has to be an enchanter. You have to use Chemtech. It's probably like Lux or Seraphine most of the time, but I mean Karma is still good. But at the same time, you're picking an enchanter. You also have to get a lot of damage, but you can't take a hyper carry early. Like you can't take Sona. This can't be a match because she's too vulnerable, and Soraka is like too good in lane. You have too much kill pressure. You can't take any other hyper carry. Like you can't take Kog'Maw for the same reason. So you have to deal with like a hyper scaling champion who is also a huge kill threat in lane. Like if you try and match hyper carries, she'll just kill you. Um, and like you take something like Seraphine and you try and play like an enchanter versus enchanter game. Not only are you just like kind of playing a worse version, like she's just gonna get Mikhail's. Like you can play Karma, you're just kind of playing a worse version, but she can also just take the Sona, right? And just play double enchanter, and like you're not gonna match double enchanter and win. Something this strong, something with like this much ability to 1v9 a game, without being drafted around, it can't be this versatile, and it can't be this good in lane. And I think that's the part that like most teams and players aren't really aware of, is how good she is in lane and how good her pairings are when you actually learn her pairings. Like she has a lot of strengths, but the fact that you can't actually match her like with other hyper carries, you can't pick similarly strong champions without her just killing them. That's really what breaks like enemy teams' ability to draft against her. These aren't optimized at all. These are just random examples, but yeah, I think she's very difficult to draft against. I think like there are answers, but like it's not worth it. I think she should just be a red side ban. Um, as far as playing Soraka, you want to play really aggressively in lane. It's very similar to old Vladimir. Like old Vladimir versus Syndra, where you didn't even have to dodge a single skill shot. You just tank everything and press Q and play against her mana pool, and you would just win. Um, it's similar in the way that if you hit your Q, you're not going to lose trades versus almost anyone. So you can play like very far into the lane. You can play very aggressively. Like a lot of matchups, like don't be afraid to walk into their minion wave and just trade Q for Q. And you'll trade like QQ and you'll take like two auto attacks and only be able to return one or zero, but it'll still be a winning trade because your Q is just that powerful. So don't be afraid to trade very aggressively. The champions that beat you are the ones that either outrange your Q or they push faster and force you to use your Q on the wave, um, or they just have more spells than you. Like Syndra, for example, like Q for Q, you hard out trade Syndra, but Syndra has literally double the Qs that you do. So that's a tough lane. But yeah, you play very aggressively in lane. E usage is by far the hardest part of your kit, and super difficult actually. So that's gonna be something you need to work on. It's crazy good at zoning in lane. Your minions are getting low. You put down the E. They either like you'll hit them with it regardless. You'll get the initial damage. You'll get like the Scorch proc if you're running Scorch, and even after getting hit with it, they have to choose between dropping that farm or walking into the snare. Obviously, if they walk forward, you come up with a Q. Um, that's a very rough trade for them. A lot of CC abilities you want to be using your E before them. So like Thresh Hook, Blitz Hook, a lot of the time you'll use your E simply to stop the possibility of a flash. Jarvan EQ, again, you're using your E before, so they can't flash it. A lot of stuff like that. Thresh Flay, too, is one of them. Being able to time the snare versus like TPs or if they're CC'd is like just something you need to learn. And you also have to consider how long you actually want to silence them for. So if an enemy is CC'd and you don't need to silence them, like you're just trying to get additional CC for the kill, then you can time it so once they come out, they're snared. But if you want to silence them, you time it so when they come out, um, they're silenced for a second, so they'll move a little bit out, but they'll get snared at the edge. So all that timing is just really difficult. Uh, Being able to just place it on the ground to zone is actually kind of hard to aim, but like super important, super powerful. Like in team fights, you place it in front of like mages, they can't walk forward and cast spells, but even like ADs or other champions, like you can place it down next to them and they can't move to that spot or they get snared. Especially like it's easier when they're walking forward. Obviously, you just place it in front of them and you delay their path. They're not able to walk forward as quickly. It gets more difficult when you're just playing front to back and you're trying to stop them from entering a certain pocket. Using it to stop champion combos can be crazy clutch. Champions like Kiana, who have very thin windows on like when they can come in. You know, if they're flanking, you can silence on that timing, and their whole team fight is ruined. Um, but a lot of games, it'll feel like a completely useless ability. It takes a lot of time to get good at. Some other things is if you hit a Q, your W gives move speed. So even if they're full health, if you're chasing someone, you need to be using your W for move speed, or just any situation where you need it. Um, with your ult, after you've bought Moonstone, you want to make sure you're always ulting with Moonstone stacked if you can. I don't think a lot of people know this. Any spell stacks Moonstone fully. So if I'm in lane and I see something happening bot, I think I'm going to be ulting soon. I can walk up, throw an E. That's like 1,000 range. It's very easy to get, and that'll fully stack Moonstone by itself, and then I can ult after that. Other than that, team fighting, you're just gonna have to have very good spacing. I think like Soraka requires more spacing than like a lot of marksmen. So she is pretty difficult in team fights as far as like skill ceiling. You want to try to get your teammates to not dive too far. I mean, obviously, if you're playing competitive, that's easier to coordinate. It's fine if they go past your range as long as they, dip back in. Soraka likes it when they're either in her range or they, dip back and forth, trade, and then come back, receive healing, go back into the fight. You don't care too much about spread out fights. You don't like them a lot, but you don't care as much as champions like Viger, right? Because you don't have like huge AOE abilities that doesn't define your character. You have single target. Obviously, your R is global, so spread out fights are fine depending on the way in which they spread out, as long as like you're not isolated versus like assassins or anything. Um, but yeah, I think that's it. I don't know. I probably missed a lot of stuff. It was like 30-minute video. I'm very tired of making this video. But yeah, if you have any questions, ask me. I do one-on-one coaching, and I would love to coach Soraka. So you know. But yeah, thanks for watching. All right, I forgot about this, so I'm adding it after. But like split is a decent option into Soraka. Um, because obviously if she is in solo lanes, that's something she struggles with. She can't match a lot of champions, but again, they have the option to flex her bot or support, which are like bot is probably her best role. But yeah, you can open with something like Karma Irelia and maybe look for like split options. Maybe like later in the draft you try and get a Camille. Camille is actually a champion Soraka hates. Um, Not only because of the split, but because in team fights, like you just ult the Soraka and she feels really bad. Especially because I like to run exhaust a lot because exhaust is turbo broken and Camille does not care about exhaust. But yeah, if Soraka has again stuff like Shen ruins Camille, stuff like Set, you know, and you can always just flex her to bot and have good split options. Like if I see Camille or Irelia again, it's just Shen or like Tryndamere. Like this is a fine option. There's other options. There's probably even better options. And I also just think split is a bad strategy. I think it is kind of dead. It was good at a time and it is no longer very good. Like it can be good. It's just not most of the time.